The gospel reveals the hidden prophecy not by adding to it from outside, but by recovering it from within, by restoring to the transmission that the text has always contained the dimensions that the institutional reading has always been too small to hold. The beings of light are real. The transformation of the relationship between consciousness and the physical world that the resurrection demonstrates is real. The cosmological knowledge encoded in the prophetic tradition is real and is being confirmed from the outside by the developing body of evidence that the honest examiner of the extraterrestrial record cannot ignore, and that the honest reader of the gospel text has always been able to find if they were willing to look without the institutional filters that have always stood between the reader and what the text is actually saying. What the text is actually saying is this: the intelligence that is the ground of all existence, the logos that was in the beginning, that was with God, that was God, has been present in human reality not as a distant theological abstraction, but as an active, guiding, specifically engaged presence that has been working through the full span of human development toward a specific destination. That destination is the full realization of what human consciousness is and what it is capable of. The transformation of the relationship between consciousness and the physical world that the resurrection demonstrates as both real and as the direction of the long development. And the specific moment of that realization, the threshold that every genuine prophetic tradition in human history has been pointing toward from its own angle of approach, is the moment that the convergence of the extraterrestrial evidence and the gospel transmission is now making visible to anyone willing to look at both honestly and simultaneously. The prophecy was never hidden in the sense of being absent. It was hidden in the sense of being present in plain sight in a text that the institutional management of the tradition has always been reading with the specific blindness that institutional management produces, the blindness of a framework that knows in advance what the text is permitted to say and therefore cannot see what the text is actually saying. The removal of that blindness is not an act of theological deconstruction. It is an act of genuine faith. The specific quality of faith that is willing to follow the transmission wherever it actually leads, that trusts the intelligence behind the text to be larger than the institution that has been managing it, that has the courage to allow what is true to be larger than what is comfortable. That courage is what the moment is asking for. From the evangelical insiders who are speaking at personal cost, from the researchers who are following the extraterrestrial evidence into territory that the institutional frameworks of science and government have always penalized the exploration of, from every person who carries both a genuine relationship with the tradition and a genuine commitment to following the evidence, who has always felt the tension between the institutional version of the faith and the larger reality that the honest reading of the tradition consistently approaches, but that the institutional framework has never been large enough to contain. The containment is ending. The transmission is larger than the container. It has always been larger than the container. And the specific quality of this moment, the convergence of disclosure and development, of extraterrestrial evidence and honest theological reading, of the external revelation of the hidden influence and the internal development of the consciousness required to receive it, is the moment in which the container finally gives way to what it was always too small to hold. The hidden prophecy is not hidden anymore. It never was. It was always there, in the text, in the evidence, in the specific quality of recognition that arrives when the honest reader of the gospel and the honest examiner of the extraterrestrial record discover that they have been reading the same transmission from different angles for the entirety of their separate inquiries. The recognition that arrives in that moment is not the recognition of a new truth. It is the recognition of a truth that was always present, waiting, with the specific patience of an intelligence that operates on a timeline that makes the full span of human history look like a single day, for the specific moment when the civilization receiving it had developed sufficiently to receive it fully. That moment is now. The gospel reveals the hidden prophecy. The hidden prophecy was always about this, and the this that it was always about is larger, stranger, more extraordinary, and more intimately connected to everything you have ever genuinely experienced in the deepest moments of your life than any institutional version of either the faith or the evidence has ever been large enough to show you. We will see you in the next layer. There is a quality of reading that the institutional church has never encouraged and has, in its more authoritarian expressions, actively suppressed. A quality of reading that brings to the biblical text the same honest, evidence following, assumption questioning attention that the best science brings to the natural world, not the reading of a believer seeking confirmation of what the tradition has already determined the text means, not the reading of a skeptic seeking ammunition for the dismissal of what the tradition has always claimed the text contains. The reading of an honest witness, a consciousness that comes to the text without the prior commitment to any conclusion and follows what the text actually says, in the specific language of the specific cultural and cosmological context in which it was written, wherever it actually leads. That reading produces results that neither the institutional believer nor the institutional skeptic is prepared for. It produces the recognition that the biblical text contains a body of cosmological knowledge, whose implications have been systematically avoided by the institutional interpretation, not because the knowledge is absent from the text, but because its presence in the text, acknowledged fully and followed honestly, produces conclusions that the institutional frameworks of both religious orthodoxy and secular materialism are not equipped to accommodate. Conclusions about the nature of the beings who appear in the text, about the craft in which they travel, about the specific quality of the events described, events that the institutional reading has categorized as miraculous in the sense of supernatural and therefore exempt from the kind of careful physical analysis that the specificity of their description actually invites. The Gospel is the culmination of a prophetic tradition that begins with the first books of the Hebrew Bible and that carries through the full span of its development a consistent thread of cosmological information about the nature of the intelligences that have been present in human reality across the full span of recorded history. That thread is most visible at the points where the institutional interpretation is most insistent that it be read symbolically, where the specific physical descriptions in the text are most elaborately explained away as allegory, as vision, as the symbolic language of a pre-scientific culture that could not describe the divine in any other terms, because the insistence on symbolic reading is itself a signal. It marks the precise points in the text where the honest physical reading produces implications that the institutional framework cannot accommodate. Drop the word gospel in the comments right now if something in the opening of this video opened something in you. If you have spent time inside the biblical text and felt, without being able to articulate it precisely, that the institutional reading was missing something essential, hit the like button to bring this to the people who carry genuine faith and genuine honesty simultaneously, and who have been waiting for a framework large enough to hold both. Share it with someone whose relationship with the gospel is real enough to survive the expansion that the honest reading produces. And if you want to support this independent research, the Super Chat is how you do it. No denominational affiliation, no institutional agenda, just the text and the evidence examined together with the full honesty that both deserve. The opening of the Gospel of John is the place where the cosmological ambition of the text is most explicit, and where the institutional reading has worked most consistently to contain its implications within a framework that is safe for the institution. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The institutional interpretation of this passage has been almost entirely focused on its theological implications, on what it says about the divine nature of Christ, about the relationship between the Son and the Father, in the Trinitarian framework that the councils of the early church constructed over the first 4 centuries of Christianity. What it has consistently avoided is the cosmological implication of the Logos concept itself, the specific quality of what the Gospel of John is actually saying about the nature of the intelligence that it identifies as the origin of everything that exists. The Logos was not a concept invented by the author of the Gospel of John. It was the central concept of the most sophisticated philosophical tradition of the ancient Mediterranean world, the Stoic tradition, later developed by the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria into a framework that became the direct intellectual precursor of the Johannine theology. In the Stoic framework, the Logos was the rational principle that pervaded and organized the cosmos, the intelligence that was immanent in everything that existed. That was the reason behind the order of the physical world, that was accessible to human consciousness through the specific faculty of reason that participated in it. In Philo's elaboration, the Logos became the intermediary between the infinite divine and the finite material world. the specific expression of divine intelligence that had the capacity to interact with the created order without the infinite being directly compromised by its contact with the finite. What the Gospel of John does with this concept is extraordinary and has never been fully appreciated within the institutional reading precisely because the institutional reading was most interested in its theological implications for the doctrine of the Incarnation. What it does is identify the Logos, the organizing intelligence of the cosmos, the rational principle that pervades all of existence, as the specific intelligence that entered the human experience in the person of Jesus. Not a supernatural intervention from outside the cosmos, an expression of the intelligence that is the cosmos, the most fundamental level of what the contact research calls non-human intelligence, the deepest layer of the hidden influence that has been guiding human development across the full span of its history, taking on the specific configuration of a human life in order to deliver a transmission calibrated to the specific capacity of the civilization at that specific moment in the long curriculum. This reading does not diminish the significance of what the Gospel describes. It expands it beyond anything the institutional framework has been able to contain. Because if the being described in the Gospel of John is not a supernatural exception to the natural order, but the most concentrated and most direct expression of the intelligence that underlies the natural order, if the Logos that became flesh is the same intelligence that has been present in the Merkabah of Ezekiel and the pillar of fire in the wilderness, and the voice from the whirlwind in Job, and the specific beings of light that appear at the critical moments of the biblical narrative from its beginning to its end, then the Gospel is not the story of a single miraculous intervention in an otherwise ordinary human history. It is the central moment in the long curriculum, the point of maximum density in the transmission, the moment when the hidden influence that has been operating through the full span of human development became most directly present in the human experience, not to end the curriculum, but to deliver the specific transmission that the next stage of the curriculum required. The beings of light that appear at the tomb on the morning of the resurrection are the detail in the Gospel narrative that the institutional reading has been most consistent in treating as purely symbolic, and that the honest physical reading finds most resistant to that treatment. Two beings in white garments, described with the specific mundane detail of eyewitness accounts, rather than the elevated, luminous language of theological allegory, sitting in the empty tomb, addressing the women who arrived to complete the burial preparations with a specificity and a practicality that is entirely inconsistent with the symbolic reading. They are not delivering a theological dissertation. They are delivering information, specific, practical, orienting information about what has happened and what to do next. The quality of the encounter, the fear of the witnesses, the specific physical details of the being's position in the tomb, the directness and the practicality of the communication is the quality of a contact experience, not a vision, not a symbolic representation of divine truth in the language of the culture. A contact experience, described with the honest precision of people who encountered something they had no existing category for and reported what they saw as accurately as their language and their composure permitted. The Transfiguration is another contact experience that the institutional reading has worked consistently to keep safely categorized as visionary and symbolic. The specific physical details of the account, the change in the appearance of Jesus' face and garments, the appearance of Moses and Elijah in a form that the disciples recognized despite having no personal acquaintance with either of them, the overshadowing cloud from which the voice emerges, the prostration of the disciples at what they describe as overwhelming light. These are the specific physical details of a contact experience at the high-intensity end of the spectrum that the modern contact research has documented. The cloud is not a meteorological phenomenon. It is the specific visual signature of a craft, a conclusion that the honest reading of the Greek text, with its specific choice of the word episkiazo to describe the overshadowing, supports in ways that the institutional reading consistently avoids. The Ascension narrative, the account of the departure of the risen Christ in the presence of the disciples, is described in the Acts of the Apostles with a physical specificity that the institutional reading has always treated as the unavoidable embarrassment of a prescientific cosmology that placed heaven literally above the earth. A cloud receives him out of their sight. Two men in white apparel, the same beings, or beings of the same category, as those at the tomb, appear and address the disciples directly about what they have just witnessed. The physical mechanics of the departure, described with the same honest precision of witness that characterizes the resurrection accounts, are the physical mechanics of a departure in a craft, not a metaphor for a theological reality. A physical event described by witnesses, recorded by the author of Acts with the same commitment to historical accuracy that characterizes the rest of that document. The Book of Revelation is the place in the gospel tradition where the cosmological knowledge encoded in the transmission is most concentrated, and where the institutional reading has most consistently retreated into symbolic interpretation as a defense against the implications of the honest physical reading. The vision of John of Patmos, written in the specific symbolic language of Jewish apocalypticism, which was itself a technical vocabulary, developed over centuries for the precise transmission of cosmological information that could not be conveyed safely in ordinary language in the political conditions of the time. Contains a body of astronomical and cosmological knowledge whose full implications modern science is only now developing the instruments to approach. The specific astronomical events described in Revelation, the darkening of the sun and the moon, the stars falling from heaven, the rolling up of the sky like a scroll, the specific sequence of cosmic events that the text describes as the prelude to the transformation of heaven and earth, are not, in the honest reading, symbolic representations of historical or theological events. They are descriptions of actual astronomical and geophysical events, encoded in the technical symbolic language of the apocalyptic tradition, that correspond with a precision that has never been adequately examined to the specific astronomical and geophysical events that modern science associates with the kind of cosmic cycle transition that the ancient traditions across multiple cultures describe as the threshold between world ages. The four living creatures of Revelation, the lion, the ox, the man, and the eagle, each with 6 wings, full of eyes before and behind, are not theological symbols in the sense that the institutional reading has always maintained. They are the same beings that appear in the Merkabah vision of Ezekiel, described in the same specific physical detail by a different witness in a different century, whose appearance in both texts with the same specific characteristics constitutes precisely the kind of independent corroboration that the contact research recognizes as one of the strongest indicators of genuine encounter, rather than cultural invention. The consistency of the description across independent witnesses separated by centuries is not a product of literary borrowing. The specific differences between the Ezekiel and Revelation accounts are exactly the differences you would expect from 2 independent eyewitnesses describing the same category of being, rather than from a later writer borrowing and elaborating an earlier text. The woman clothed with the sun in Revelation chapter 12, standing on the moon crowned with 12 stars, giving birth in the presence of a great red dragon, has been interpreted within the institutional framework as representing the Church, or Israel, or the Virgin Mary, depending on the specific tradition doing the interpreting. What it has not been interpreted as within any mainstream tradition is what the honest astronomical reading of the specific celestial details suggests. An actual astronomical configuration, a specific arrangement of the sun, moon, and the constellation Virgo with the planets that the text encodes as 12 stars, that occurred on a specific historical date, and that the author of Revelation was describing not as a symbolic vision, but as a specific celestial sign, whose astronomical precision was intended to anchor the cosmological transmission of the text to a specific moment in the astronomical cycles that the prophetic tradition was tracking. The precise astronomical configuration described in Revelation 12 occurred on September 23rd of 2017, a date that was identified years in advance by independent researchers working from the astronomical data in the text, and whose arrival was observed by a small number of people who understood its significance within the context of the long prophetic tradition. The institutional church, when this identification was brought to its attention, responded with the standard combination of dismissal and concern that it has always deployed against readings of the prophetic tradition that produce specific, testable, falsifiable claims, rather than the safely unfalsifiable symbolic interpretations that the institutional framework prefers. But the astronomical precision of the configuration, the fact that the specific arrangement of celestial bodies described in the text occurred on the predicted date with the accuracy that only an honest reading of the actual astronomical content of the text could have produced, is a form of evidence that the symbolic reading cannot accommodate. The letter to the Hebrews contains what is arguably the most explicit statement in the entire New Testament of the cosmological framework that the honest reading of the gospel tradition consistently approaches and that the institutional reading consistently avoids. The cloud of witnesses, the specific Greek word nephos, which refers to a dense cloud or mass rather than an atmospheric cloud, that surrounds the arena of human development is not, in the honest reading, a metaphor for the encouraging presence of deceased saints in some transcendent realm. It is a description of a specific category of beings, the same category that appears in the Merkabah vision and at the tomb and at the transfiguration and throughout the prophetic tradition, whose presence in the reality structure that human consciousness inhabits is continuous, not occasional, and whose relationship to the human development that they are witnessing is active, not passive. The arena metaphor that the author of Hebrews uses, the Greek word agon, the athletic competition watched by a stadium of spectators, is not a metaphor of passive spectatorship. In the Greek world that the author of Hebrews was writing for, the agon was not entertainment. It was the central institution of a culture that understood physical competition as the most concentrated and most revealing expression of the qualities of character that the culture valued most. The spectators at an agon were not passive observers. They were participants in a social and spiritual event whose significance extended far beyond the outcome of any individual competition. And the cloud of witnesses surrounding the agon of human development in the letter to the Hebrews are not passive observers of a process whose outcome is already determined. They are participants, active, invested, genuinely engaged in the outcome of the specific process they are watching, whose presence in the arena is itself a form of support, of transmission, of the ongoing guidance that the contact research has always described as the characteristic mode of operation of the non-human intelligences present in human reality. The gospel, read honestly and fully, without the institutional filters that have been applied to it for 2,000 years, is the most concentrated single transmission in the entire body of evidence that this channel has been examining. It is not in competition with the extraterrestrial evidence. It is part of the same evidence, the same long curriculum, the same hidden influence becoming progressively less hidden through the specific transmissions that each stage of the curriculum delivers to the specific capacity of the civilization at that stage to receive them. The gospel is the central transmission, the point of maximum density in the long sequence of guided development that has been bringing human consciousness toward the threshold of open contact with the intelligence that the tradition has always called divine and that the evidence consistently shows has been present in human reality in ways that are not confined to the inner experience of faith, but are physically, historically, documentably real. Bloco 3. The resurrection is the event at the center of the gospel transmission, and the event that the institutional reading has been most invested in protecting from the honest physical analysis that the specificity of its documentation invites. The resurrection accounts in the four Gospels are not the accounts of a theological doctrine being illustrated through narrative. They are the accounts of witnesses, multiple, independent, often reluctant witnesses whose testimony has the specific quality of people reporting something they did not expect, did not fully understand, and could not have invented because the specific details of what they report are precisely the details that a human inventor of a theological narrative would not have chosen. The empty tomb is the foundational physical fact of the resurrection accounts and the one that the institutional reading has been most careful to treat as a spiritual symbol rather than a physical event. But the empty tomb is described with the specific mundane detail of a crime scene report, the specific arrangement of the burial cloths, the position of the head cloth separate from the body cloths, the specific sequence of discovery by the different witnesses, the specific reactions of the different disciples who arrive and enter the tomb. These are not the details of a theological narrative. They are the details of a physical event recorded by people who were there, whose specific reactions, the fear, the confusion, the initial failure to understand what had happened, are precisely the reactions you would expect from witnesses of a genuine physical event that exceeded their existing categories, rather than from the authors of a deliberate theological construction. What happened to the body of Jesus in the tomb is a question that the honest physical reading of the resurrection accounts raises in a form that neither the institutional theological reading nor the secular debunking tradition has ever adequately addressed. The institutional reading requires the adoption of a framework of supernatural intervention that places the event outside the territory of physical analysis by definition, a move that protects the doctrine but abandons the text, which is itself a physical historical document making specific claims about specific physical events. The secular debunking tradition requires the adoption of explanations, theft of the body, mass hallucination, legendary development over decades of oral tradition, that are not adequate to the specific physical details of the accounts and that require a degree of motivated reasoning that the evidence does not support. The honest reading, the reading that follows the evidence without the prior commitment to either the institutional theological conclusion or the secular materialist conclusion, arrives at a third possibility that neither tradition has been willing to examine. The possibility that the resurrection accounts are describing a genuine physical event, a transformation of the physical body of Jesus into a configuration that the witnesses could not fully account for within their existing categories, that is best understood not as a supernatural exception to the natural order, but as the most dramatic single instance of the kind of physical transformation that the contact research, at its deepest layer, consistently points toward as the destination of the long curriculum of human development, the transformation of the relationship between consciousness and the physical body, the demonstration in the most concentrated and most publicly witnessed form that the curriculum had yet produced, of the specific quality of the relationship between consciousness and matter that the full development of human awareness makes possible. The appearances of the risen Christ are described in the gospel accounts with a specific quality that the institutional reading has always found difficult to systematize, because the accounts are simultaneously insisting on the physical reality of what is described and describing physical properties that do not correspond to the ordinary physical reality of a biological body. The risen Christ eats. He invites Thomas to touch his wounds. He walks with the disciples on the road to Emmaus in a form they do not initially recognize. He enters locked rooms without the use of doors. He appears and disappears in ways that the witnesses find disorienting precisely because they are simultaneously familiar and impossible within the framework of the physical reality they know. He is physical and not entirely physical simultaneously, inhabiting the material world in a way that is not confined by its ordinary constraints, while remaining genuinely present in it, rather than simply appearing to be. This description of a consciousness that is present in the physical world without being fully confined by its ordinary constraints, that can interact with the material reality of other physical beings, while operating outside the specific limitations that define ordinary biological existence, is a description that the contact research has encountered before. Not in the resurrection account specifically, but in the descriptions of the transformed state of consciousness that the most advanced contact experiences consistently point toward as the destination of the long curriculum. The beings encountered in the deepest contact experiences are described with the same quality, present in physical reality without being entirely confined by it, capable of interaction with the material world while operating from a relationship to space and time that is qualitatively different from the relationship that defines ordinary human experience. The Pentecost event recorded in the Acts of the Apostles is the moment in the gospel narrative that most directly parallels the contact transmission model that the broader evidence consistently points toward. The specific physical phenomena described, the sound of a rushing mighty wind filling the house, the appearance of what the text describes as divided tongues, as of fire resting on each of those present, the sudden capacity of the disciples to communicate in languages they had not previously known, are not adequately explained by the institutional theological reading as a symbolic representation of the divine empowerment of the early church. They are the specific physical phenomena of a high-intensity contact event, a concentrated transmission of the kind that the contact research has documented at the extreme end of the spectrum of contact experiences, in which the physical and neurological effects on the recipients are as significant as the informational content of what is transmitted. The glossolalia, the speaking in tongues, that characterizes the Pentecost event, and that has been a source of both fascination and embarrassment within the various streams of the Christian tradition, is not, in the honest reading, primarily a linguistic phenomenon. It is a neurological one. A specific alteration of the relationship between consciousness and the language faculty that produces in its authentic form a quality of expression that bypasses the ordinary filters of the conscious mind and accesses a level of communication that is not dependent on the learned structures of any particular human language. The contact research has documented parallel phenomena in high-intensity contact experiences, alterations of the language faculty, the production of sounds and syllables that do not correspond to any known language, but that carry for the experiencer a quality of meaning and significance that exceeds anything that ordinary language produces. The Pentecost event is the most publicly witnessed and most carefully documented instance of this category of experience in the entire historical record. The letters of Paul contain the most philosophically sophisticated engagement with the cosmological implications of the gospel transmission in the entire New Testament, and the one that the institutional reading has been most consistent in reducing to theological doctrine, rather than engaging with as the cosmological statement it actually is. The specific passage in the first letter to the Corinthians in which Paul describes what he calls the spiritual body, the soma pneumatikon, is the place where the gospel tradition comes closest to an explicit statement of the transformation of the relationship between consciousness and the physical body that the resurrection accounts describe, and that the contact research consistently points toward as the destination of the long curriculum. Paul is not describing the resurrection body as an immaterial spiritual existence that replaces the physical body after death. He is describing a transformed physical existence, a configuration of the relationship between consciousness and matter that is genuinely physical while being free from the specific constraints that define the ordinary physical body. The analogy he uses, the seed and the plant, the radical difference between the form in which something is planted and the form in which it grows, is the analogy of genuine transformation rather than replacement. The plant is not a different thing from the seed. It is the same thing in a different configuration, a configuration that was always potential in the seed, but that could not be actualized without the specific conditions of its development. The spiritual body is not a replacement for the physical body. It is the physical body in a configuration that the full development of the consciousness inhabiting it makes possible. This is the cosmological statement at the center of the gospel transmission, not the promise of an afterlife in which the soul survives the death of the body in a disembodied spiritual existence. The promise of a transformation of the relationship between consciousness and the physical world that the full development of human awareness makes possible. A transformation that the resurrection of Jesus is demonstrating as both real and as the destination toward which the long curriculum of human development has always been oriented. The gospel is not primarily about what happens after death. It is primarily about what becomes possible in the relationship between consciousness and reality when consciousness has developed to the level that the curriculum has been building toward, and the resurrection is not primarily a proof of divine power. It is primarily a demonstration of human potential, the most concentrated and most publicly witnessed demonstration of what the long development of human consciousness is moving toward, that the tradition preserving the demonstration has never fully been able to hold. There is a moment in the honest reading of the gospel, a moment that arrives differently for different readers, but that has a specific recognizable quality when it comes, when the text stops being an object of study and becomes something else, something that is looking back at the reader with the same quality of attention that the reader has been bringing to it. Not in the mystical sense of a personal divine encounter, though that reading is available to those for whom it is meaningful. In the sense that a transmission, when it is received with sufficient honesty and sufficient openness, does what transmissions are designed to do. It changes the receiver, not by adding information to an existing framework, but by reorganizing the framework itself, by producing the specific quality of recognition that is not the acquisition of new knowledge, but the recovery of something that was always present, but had been obscured by the layers of institutional management that 2,000 years of organized religion have deposited over the original signal. The original signal is extraordinary. It is more extraordinary than the institutional version has ever been permitted to be, not because the institutional version invented something false, but because it preserved something true in a container too small for what it was preserving, a container shaped by the specific political, cultural, and psychological needs of the institutions that built it, rather than by the specific dimensions of the transmission it was attempting to hold. The creeds and the doctrines and the carefully managed interpretations are not lies. They are inadequate. They are the best that the institutional framework could do with a transmission whose full implications would have dissolved the institution that was attempting to preserve it. And the dissolution of the institution was a price that the institution was not willing to pay, even in the service of the transmission it existed to protect. That price is now being paid anyway. Not through the dramatic collapse of organized religion that the secular tradition has been predicting for a century and a half without the prediction being fulfilled, but through the gradual, irreversible process by which the evidence, the extraterrestrial evidence, the contact research, the honest physical reading of the ancient texts that the gospel tradition is part of, the developing body of scientific and philosophical work that is converging on a framework large enough to hold what the institutional containers have always been too small for, accumulates to the point where the institutional management of the transmission becomes impossible to sustain. Without a degree of dishonesty that the people most genuinely committed to what the tradition is transmitting are no longer willing to maintain. The evangelical insiders who are speaking, carefully, at personal and professional cost, in the specific language of their tradition but pointing beyond the boundaries of the institutional interpretation that tradition has always enforced, are not betraying the gospel. They are the latest expression of the same honest witness that produced the gospel in the first place. The disciples who reported what they saw at the tomb and at the transfiguration and at the ascension were not operating within an institutional framework. They were operating within the same framework that every honest witness operates within. The framework of what they actually encountered, reported as accurately as their language and their courage permitted, regardless of the institutional consequences of the reporting. The evangelical insiders who are now pointing toward the convergence of the gospel transmission and the extraterrestrial evidence are doing the same thing, following the text where it actually leads, reporting what the honest reading actually shows, accepting the institutional consequences of the honesty because the alternative, the continuation of a management of the transmission that has become indistinguishable from its suppression, is no longer something their conscience can sustain. The convergence they are pointing toward is real. The gospel tradition and the extraterrestrial evidence are not two separate bodies of information that happen to overlap at certain points. They are two perspectives on the same reality, two angles of approach to the same long curriculum, two channels through which the same hidden influence has been delivering the same fundamental transmission to the same developing civilization at different stages of its development and through the different symbolic languages that each stage made available. The Merkabah of Ezekiel and the craft documented in the modern contact research are descriptions of the same category of phenomenon from witnesses separated by 2.5 millennia. The beings of light at the tomb and the non-human intelligences documented in the congressional testimony of David Grush are descriptions of the same category of presence from witnesses operating in radically different cultural and institutional contexts. The cosmological knowledge encoded in the Book of Revelation and the astronomical data being produced by modern space telescopes are converging on the same description of the same cosmic cycles from two directions that have never before been brought into the same conversation with the full honesty that both deserve. That conversation is what this channel exists to facilitate, not to replace the gospel with the extraterrestrial evidence or to reduce the extraterrestrial evidence to the gospel tradition, to create the space in which both can be held simultaneously, in which the full depth of what the gospel transmission contains can be recovered from, beneath the institutional management that has been obscuring it, and in which the full significance of the extraterrestrial evidence can be understood within the context of the long curriculum that the gospel tradition has always been part of, the space in which the honest reader of the text and the honest examiner of the evidence can discover that they have been looking at the same thing from different angles, and that the convergence of their perspectives produces something larger than either perspective alone. That larger thing is the framework that the current moment requires, the framework large enough to hold the full depth of human spiritual experience alongside the full weight of the physical evidence, large enough to hold the genuine faith of the billions who have carried the gospel tradition across 2 millennia, alongside the genuine inquiry of the researchers who have been following the extraterrestrial evidence without the institutional permission of any religious or scientific authority, large enough to hold the specific quality of the human encounter with the divine, with the transcendent, with the presence that the tradition has always described as more real than the reality it appears within, alongside the specific physical reality of non-human intelligences that have been present in human reality in ways that are not confined to the inner experience of faith, but are documentably, historically, physically real.